There we go. All right. So, as Aaron mentioned, I've been working at the Northeastern District office for a little while. It's been, I think, about 7 years now. And as part of my role, what I do is candidate development. So I am always looking for people who are called to ministry, who are getting a sense from God that there is perhaps some equipping that they're to do, or perhaps it's for full-time service, perhaps it's just to take some ministry and Bible and theology classes so that you minister better within your own congregation. That's actually how I also started in this. I enrolled in what we called the Ministerial Study Program when I was working with a youth group down in West Virginia, and that throughout the years just continued to grow into me working full-time in ministry. So I think there's a lot of different ways that God calls us into ministry, so that's just a little bit about my story there. As part of my role, as many of you know, I travel with a district team and visit our different churches. We have, at this point, about 78 different locations in upstate New York, and we have the opportunity to go around and just visit and talk with the pastors and talk with the staff and hopefully encourage and see if resources are needed and all of those kind of things. So that's just a powerful part of what we're able to do in these roles. Melanie Thornton, I'll give you a little bit of her background also. She serves in so many capacities, but a couple of those are, she essentially is our office manager in a lot of ways. She's also the executive assistant to our district superintendent. But she has a wealth of knowledge in worship ministries. And she's often going around talking with churches, doing consultations. She teaches seminars on worship. So please connect with her also after the service. So as we start this morning, I have a question for you. And this is one of those rhetorical questions that you don't need to answer out loud. But have you ever felt invisible? Okay. I see some nods, and I know I have also. And throughout our lives, there's a lot of experiences that many of us have had that we probably share with one another. When we were kids, perhaps we felt invisible when teams were picked. I wasn't all that athletic, so that's part of my story. Some people felt invisible maybe as dating began and socializing was happening, and they weren't asked out or weren't invited to certain gatherings and parties and those types of things. We might have felt invisible as we applied to training programs or colleges, and the ones that we wanted to go to didn't pick us, and we felt overlooked. We may feel overlooked even now if we're looking for a job and those employers aren't picking us. We may feel overlooked when promotions happen. We may feel invisible. Perhaps someone has stolen your ideas at work and shared them as your own. That's one of those situations where sometimes we feel invisible. There's various serious times also for those of you who have been sick or have had a family member who is very sick. You may have felt invisible to God because your prayers seemingly weren't being heard, and we kind of wonder where God is in all of that. I have a good friend who works with refugees who are displaced from their home country over in Southeast Asia. And these are individuals who are struggling to find income. They're struggling to find education for their kids. They're trying many days to figure out where their food is coming from that day. So they're feeling very invisible to that world that's moving on around them. As we wrestle with this sense of kind of, does God see me? Does the world see me? Is anyone even noticing? Sometimes we tend to ask very similar questions. Questions like, does anybody love me? Does anyone see my pain? Are God and church for real? Does my life matter? What will become of me? As I listen to my friend describe her work with refugees, as we watch what's unfolding in Afghanistan, as Pastor Aaron was praying, as we talk to our neighbors and our friends, we see questions like this reflected in their lives, in the way that they talk. So as we consider how God responds to these challenges, we're going to look to Scripture in Genesis 16, which details the history, if you remember, of Abram, Sarai, and Hagar. And right before this chapter, God had established a covenant with Abram. You may have remembered this. God repeats his earlier promises to multiply Abram's descendants in the land of Canaan, and he clarifies that his heir will come from him, meaning Abram, directly, and will not be a slave who's born in his household. Because Aaron is saying, will it be so-and-so in my household? And God is saying, no, this person is going to come from you. So we're going to start by backing up a little bit and looking in Genesis 15. It says, now the word of the Lord came to him. This one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. So he took him outside and said, look at the sky and count the stars, if you're able to count them. Then he said to him, your offspring will be that numerous. Abram believed the Lord, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So based on these clear words from God to Abram, we might expect that Abram would not have any doubts, would not have any questions as to how God was going to fulfill his promises. But as we're going to see in this particular next chapter, that wasn't the case. The questions that I just mentioned and the emotions that go along with them ended up impacting both Abram and his wife Sarai, and it produced a different response than what God had wanted. So there are times when we are facing very tough questions, we're facing challenges, and just give me a nod if you've ever kind of started doing it on your own. You've thought, you know what, things aren't moving quick enough. I think I can see the path that I'm supposed to go. And we often try to meet our needs on our own. We kind of think we're going to help God out with a solution in this. So we're going to go through Genesis 16 and look at this. So the passage starts out, it says, Abram's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family. And Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan for 10 years. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. So what we see unfolding here is God told Abram what he was going to do, but you'll notice he didn't tell him exactly how he was going to do it. So Sarai and Abram attempted to fill in information by creating their own plan. Now, at this point, Sarai and Abram would have been in Canaan for about 10 years, it says, and so she was in her mid-70s. So not being able to have children in that culture, as many of you know, would have been humiliating. She was aware of the promise that God had made to her husband, that he would have an heir from his own body. She knew that part of it. So it was difficult for her to understand, how is Abram going to father this nation when she's not able to have children? So, and it's really years later that the Lord appeared to Abram and said specifically that Sarai would have a son. We see that in the next chapter, and it's about, I think, 13 years later that detail is filled in. So in that surrounding culture, the custom of having heirs through a surrogate was well known. And while this was accepted in the culture, this was not God's plan. This was not the way that God designed marriage and family to happen. So we read that Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. It's likely that Sarai acquired Hagar when they were in Egypt earlier. If you remember, they went down to Egypt, and that was one of those couple of times that Abram pretended that his wife Sarai was his sister, and it ended up that Pharaoh took her into his household, and that story evolved. So it is likely that when they left Egypt, that Sarai may have been one of those gifts given to her from the Pharaoh, or they just acquired her as they were leaving. So while Sarai took matters into her own hand, it is important to note that Abram did go along with this. Okay, there's no resisting. There's at least nothing that we see recorded here. They both accepted this alternate plan as an attempt to bring about the promise that God had made earlier. So it is important to also note that Abram is the one that heard this directly from God, and he still went along with the plan. There's a guy, R. Kent Hughes, who noted, the whole matter was so ugly. Normally, the girl's father gave the woman to be married, but Sarai gave her away. And Hagar had no say in the matter. She was taken and she was given. She was treated as a commodity. I know for many of us, as we listen to the reports coming out of Afghanistan of the treatment of young girls and women, this description runs parallel. I know when I saw this, and then I'm also watching the news, it's hard not to see this correlation happening. And I don't know about you, but my heart just aches. And I'm sure one of the questions that they are asking is, does anybody see me? Does anybody see what's happening? Does God see this? What's going on? As we read in this passage, we see that Abram slept with Hagar and conceived a child. So what happens next is we see this adjustment when this does not go well, to try to get back on course, because what they have discovered is the plan that they have come up with does not exactly turn out the way that they expected. After Hagar became pregnant, this was not a happy kind of family and not a happy tent, so to speak. It really took a bad turn. Often we experience this same thing. We try to find our own solution. We try to figure out, without listening to God, what that way is that we're going to get to that point B that we see where we're supposed to be. And when that doesn't go as planned, we try to desperately figure out, how do we get back on track? So the next part of this, we read, when she, which is Hagar, saw that she was pregnant, her mistress Sarai became contemptible to her. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You're responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and when she saw that she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between me and you." Abram replied to Sarai, "Here, your slave is in your power. Do whatever you want with her." Then Sarai mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. And that word mistreated is the same one that we will see later for how the Egyptians mistreated the Hebrews. So she mistreated her harshly. And Sarai turned her frustration where? To her husband, to Abram. And she appealed to God to judge the situation. And we're going to see, as this chapter continues, that in fact God was watching all of this unfold, and he did see exactly what happened. So they both were sharing blame as far as what had transpired. Sarai devised a plan that went against God's design for marriage, and Abram went along with it. Instead of reminding Sarai of God's plan, perhaps of reassuring her that it's okay that this isn't happening right now. I know God is in charge. And he too made this decision to go forward with this alternate way. We also don't see Abram or Sarai repenting. We don't see them asking for wisdom in the situation when this starts really derailing and going badly. Instead, this author Hughes noted that Abram went along with the Mesopotamian social convention, which stipulated that if a concubine claims equality with her mistress because she has borne her children, her mistress may demote her to her former status. So again, we see Abram responding from the culture that's around them instead of how God would want the response to be. So this alternate plan to produce an heir for Abram turned into a disaster. So I'm curious, as we go through this, and again, this is rhetorical, have you ever done this? Okay, have you ever tried to run ahead of God, and then when things didn't go as planned, we go, okay, I got to fix this. So how do I fix this? How do I get back on track? I'm sure that we all have our own stories to tell. I know I have my stories to tell, and perhaps that'll be good lunch conversation today afterwards. But one of the best solutions is really to confess to God that we've gone off course, and we need His wisdom in this. I do think it's important to say, though, many of our decisions have lasting results, and it's not necessarily going to be just flip the page back before we developed our own option. We just can't turn back time. Because like Abraham and Sarai, sometimes our plans involved other people. You know, sometimes that involved marriages, sometimes it involved children, sometimes it involved accepting, the job offer that you knew wasn't the direction you were supposed to go. So it's not like we can just flip the page back and rewind that, but we have to go forward understanding that there were some consequences to that. So the amazing truth is that we serve a God who sees our struggles, hears our questions, and offers His forgiveness and wisdom. So the angel of the Lord found her, and this is Hagar, by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. He said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" She replied, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai." So it is likely, if she was at that spring on the way to Shur, that she was headed home. She was headed back to her people, that she was going to try to reconnect and figure out how she could go back. She was also, I am sure, wondering if anyone saw her pain. She wondered what would become of her and her son. So the angel of the Lord appeared to this single mother-to-be to provide instruction and guidance for her as she sat in misery. If you'll notice, he addressed her by name, and he asked her, where have you come from? Where are you going? He was interacting with her on a very intimate, personal level. Have you ever had God show up when you were at a low point? I would think most of us have. I love hearing stories about moments in time when God intervened into our lives and really just showed us, and we knew His presence was there and we felt His connection with us. Our international workers report often that the Lord is showing up in dreams and visions to those who are wondering about God and wondering what is true. This is happening consistently throughout the Middle East. And we are seeing that the angel of the Lord is still showing up, and He is showing up to let people know, I see you. So as we continue, the angel of the Lord said to her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her authority." The angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count." The angel of the Lord said to her, "You have conceived, and you will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. This man will be like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will settle near all his relatives." So the angel instructed her to go back to Sarai and to submit. He then shared a promise with her to let her know, one, that she would survive, because in order for her to have descendants, she was going to live through this. So she knew that she would survive, and that she would be blessed by these descendants. She was the only woman in the Bible that received this type of promise. There's a few others, if you remember, who were promised offspring and heirs and descendants, but she is the only woman mentioned with this type of promise. She was also told to name her son Ishmael, which means God has heard. Wouldn't this be an interesting reminder throughout her entire life? Every time she called her son, she would remember that God had heard her. Every time that his name was spoken, again, this would come back. Now, we do see an interesting description of Ishmael in verse 12. This man will be like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will settle near all his relatives. Now, I don't know about you. I've never had any children. But if somebody gave me that description for a child that I was going to have, I might pay attention a little bit and go, okay, I'm not sure what's going on there. And a guy named Derek Kidner said, to some degree, the son of Abram would be a shadow, almost a parody of his father. His 12 princes, notable in their times, but not in the history of salvation. His restless existence, no pilgrimage, but an end in itself. So Ishmael ended up having 12 sons, and like this author was saying, it was almost like a parallel to Abram, but a very different outcome, because it wasn't a focus on the history of salvation and bringing about redemption, but it was a very different focus on that. And in essence, this offspring became a thorn to God's people, both under the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. But Hagar responded to the angel of the Lord. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roi." For she said, "In this place have I actually seen the one who sees me?" That is why the well is called Ber Lahai Roi. It is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. It is so fascinating as I read this to note that Hagar did not focus on the promise that God had just given her. What did she focus on instead? She focused on worshiping God. She focused on naming him El Roi, meaning you are the God of seeing. She was wrapped up in the experience that she had just had and the conversation that she had just had. If Hagar had been questioning if anyone saw her pain, she got that answer very clearly, and she no longer doubted that God in fact saw her. So this chapter does conclude with Hagar giving birth to a son for Abram, and several chapters later we do read in Genesis chapter 21, the conflict between these two women didn't resolve. And Hagar and her son Ishmael were eventually put out of the household, and they almost died. But again, we see that God protects her and her son, and they lived apart from Abram and Sarai. So we know that they didn't kind of live happily ever after in this situation, but were removed from the household. But God again came and ministered directly to her. Isn't it humbling to see that God sees us? He desires this relationship with us. He actually notices when we're in pain, when we're asking these questions. It's also, I think, somewhat daunting to realize that when we step outside of God's plan, that there's consequences. And at times these consequences continue even after we have made a decision to reconcile our relationship with God and to submit to his guidance. We still have to deal with those consequences. One of the stories that came to my mind in looking at this was the story of our own denomination and how it reflected a leader that chose to follow God's guidance even when it was challenging. He could have made compromises, and he chose not to. His name was A.B. Simpson, as most of you probably know, and his heart for marginalized people to know God drove his mission and continues today. Many of you are familiar with the story, but in case you're not, I'm going to share a little bit from a manuscript that our district superintendent, Dave Lynn, wrote, just to give you the background of the story. The founder of the Christian Missionary Alliance, Dr. Albert Simpson, discovered that for him to get to a place of blessing, that the Lord had to take him through a radical experience of paring down. Before the launch of the Alliance, Simpson had been a pastor in a good denominational church in Louisville, Kentucky. While there, he discovered a special burden for the lost and a remarkable gift of preaching. He began to seek the Lord for opportunities to use these gifts. The Lord brought him the choice opportunity to take a church in New York City where the streets were teeming with immigrants. He told the church leadership there that if he were to come, he would be on mission to reach these many thousands for Christ. Well, the leaders of this well-to-do congregation readily agreed. I mean, who could argue with evangelism? But then they arrived, and it started to happen. Simpson began preaching Christ on the crowded streets of New York, and hundreds came to Christ in a short period of time. He started bringing them to worship at the church and was eager to have them part of the life of the body of the church there. But the new believers, they smelled different, they dressed different, they talked different, and they were poor. The members of this particular church were elite members of society and struggled with the inclusion of the converts. Eventually, Simpson put it to a vote of the board. Can these new converts be admitted as members of the church? Now, we don't know exactly how the discussion proceeded. There's no record of that we can find. But in the end, the answer was no. The board felt that the immigrants simply did not fit their church. But Simpson was a man on mission, and in a moment of decision, he resigned his esteemed, well-paid pulpit to do evangelism on the streets of New York. He began by conducting a big promotional meeting to urge his view on others who had already seen God do great things in this new work. He invited them to meet him on November 23rd, 1881, to plan this future ministry together. 7 people showed up. Did he spit and moan about what went wrong with the other Christians? No. The Alliance history, there's a book on it called All for Jesus. It records Simpson's recollection of the event. The small group then knelt in prayer to thank God that we were poor, few, and weak. We threw ourselves upon the might of the Holy Ghost. In 2 years, there were hundreds of people involved in that work, and soon after there were thousands. And today there are millions worldwide. So we see a very key moment where Simpson could have thrown away God's plan and said, no, this could work. I can not do this and preach to the marginalized, but instead I'm going to focus on the church that's in front of me. But that wasn't the plan that God had for Simpson. Now, some of you know that our national office for the Christian Missionary Alliance used to be in Colorado Springs. It has just moved to Reynoldsburg, Ohio. And just yesterday at a community event in Reynoldsburg, John Stumbo, our president, described to the Reynoldsburg community the Alliance in this way. He said, we are a 134-year-old organization that has always cared about people, especially people who are marginalized, the overlooked. We have a heart for people, and we believe that every life is better with Jesus in it. We're a people who love Jesus and aren't ashamed of that. An organization that has 2,000 churches worshiping in 37 languages here in the United States and work in 70 countries. We care about doing good all over the planet. We have hospitals, clinics, relief, development, all sorts of help. If there's a fire, a flood, a hurricane, we're probably there helping out in some way. So this focused on the marginalized and overlooked people that A.B. Simpson had back in 1881 continues to be a priority for the Alliance. Had Simpson followed the solution of the church by not including the immigrants and kept going down the same path, it's likely that there would have been a different ending. But he followed God, and the God who sees us and who sees the marginalized and deeply desires a relationship with us. So the immigrants that Simpson reached out to, they probably also wondered, does anybody see me? Does anyone love me? And through this outreach back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were able to see God and see him in a way that they answered those questions in the affirmative. They knew that they were seen. They knew that God loved them and saw them. So as we wrap up today, I just have a couple of very simple questions. Do you know that God sees you? We sang earlier in this service that we are faultless to stand before the throne. The reason that we are faultless to stand before the throne is because we have made a decision to become one of God's people. So I do urge you, if there is ever any doubt of whether or not you are one of God's people, reach out to Aaron, to Bonnie, to other leaders in the church, and have that discussion to make sure that you understand completely what that means. Another question I would have is, who in your life needs to know that God sees them? Each one of us has a circle of influence which is unique to us. No one of us has the exact same family, coworkers, neighborhood, ministry, community connections. And it's important or critical to remember that there are relationships that are ours alone. We are the exact person that God has positioned to let that person know that God sees them and wants a relationship with them. So take time this week, listen to how God wants to direct you, because I am sure that there are people all around your own circle who have the questions that we talked about, who are wondering, does God see me? Does anybody see that I am in pain? Does God love me? What's going to become of me? So listen for those opportunities to help point them towards the God who in fact does see them. So Aaron is going to come up and close us in prayer, but I do encourage you, if there's anyone who wants to have a conversation about that or anything else, please make sure that happens today.